Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Jungian analyst Mark Winborn. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, John. It's good to be with you again.
Mark, today we're talking about reverie, and I know you train analysts and therapists, and you have written about reverie within within the therapeutic context, and so I wonder whether maybe it's possible if we could start um, with how you got onto this topic, why you think this topic's important and where you started with it all.
Well, I started when I was a candidate in um, training for to become a Jungian analyst, and a particular supervisor of mine, Mel Marshak, spoke about it quite a lot. And
Mm,
at first, I didn't really understand what it was at all, uh,
mm,
and it just sounded kind of like um, in a way imagination. But I later learned that it's not just attempting to imagine something. It's really an openness to one's subconscious in which things can float into awareness that are meaningfully linked to what's going on within myself, what's going on in the room with a patient. And hearing how this particular analyst, Mel Marshak, worked with her own reverie and came to interpretive statements out of her reverie was really fascinating to me. And then I found that there was literature within the psychoanalytic world about this, and
it,
that
just
there were,
just one thing with that though, Mark, is that that literature was maybe out of the Jungian world, wasn't it? Because it's not a word that you might see as such in Jungian literature, although it might be described in other ways.
right, right. It does come out of a different literature, the literature of Wilfred Bion is seen as the primary analyst who incorporated this, and he comes out of the idea of the mother-infant dyad, the union of the mother and the infant, and watching how mothers would be attuned to their infant, both to what they're doing, but also a psychological attunement, as though the baby has is inhabiting their mind and shaping their thoughts. I'm going to turn this off. And shaping their thoughts around the about the infant who they're engaged with, and that these thoughts and then the things that they respond to the baby with, whether it's comforting or cooing or playful interaction, all of these are shaped by the mother's reverie. And so that's really where Bion came up with the idea of reverie and pulled it into the analytic or therapeutic space of the analyst's reverie of the patient. And then eventually, hopefully, the patient's capacity to have reverie themselves.
So one could see therapy, speaking as a layperson or someone who went along to a Jungian therapist, um, an exploration of each other's reveries in a way, or some kind of space where that's held. I mean, would that be a fair way to describe?
Yeah, I think that's an ideal state that we get to with certain patients. Not all patients can do that sort of work, but particularly I use the analytic couch. So some of my patients are lying down rather than sitting up.
Right.
And what I find is that their capacity to engage in reverie increases as they're not so focused on the social interaction with me.
Right.
And while I'm still paying attention to them, even while they're lying down, I'm also freer to engage in my own reverie because there's more space without all of the social tracking that occurs in face-to-face sitting up in exchanges.
Okay. That's a bit Freudian, isn't it?
Well, there is a school within the Jungian world, the Society for Analytical Psychology, and Michael Fordham, who did incorporate a lot of psychoanalytic practices within their Jungian framework.
Mm.
So they still conceptualized along Jungian lines, things like complexes and self, ego and shadow, things like that, but how they were trying to access those phenomenon also looked, they had a higher frequency of sessions and used the analytic couch, both things that I find increase the depth of the work that goes on.
So if you don't have to worry about the normal social stuff, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
one becomes a little bit more open to reverie.
Right, right. There's a chapter in my second book on shared realities focused on reverie, but the title of the chapter is called Watching the Clouds Together. And, you know, if you ever had the experience as a kid growing up and lying on your back on the grass, looking up with a friend and watching the clouds, but also speaking aloud, but without a particular purpose, what you're seeing there. It's just kind of like a game.
Mm.
And if you were looking directly at your friend during that game, you probably wouldn't have the same mindset as if both of you were looking up into the clouds. Except in a shared reverie in the analytic space, we're attempting to look inward at our thoughts, our feelings, our bodily sensations, and then wondering how they're related to what we're speaking about.
Mm. That's it strikes me also as kind of a remedial therapy, isn't it? Because I don't know, maybe in our culture, you know, being busy is highly regarded, or uh, this is, you know, being a kind of half ex-60s hippie oriented person. This is what
Mm-hmm.
I wrote in the I read in the introduction to Gaston Bachelart's The
Mm-hmm.
Poetics of Reverie. And
Mm-hmm.
it was written by Daniel Russell. He said, Reverie has always been understood, especially in the United States, to be unproductive, impractical, and so completely unempirical as to be considered almost immoral in a society oriented towards pure and sometimes mindless action. So
Mm-hmm.
how would you respond to that?
Oh, I think it's spot on. And I think the capacity for reverie has decreased significantly as our use of on-screen and phone technologies has increased dramatically. We spend much more time sitting looking at our phones and our computers and our tablets than we do in social interaction now. So much so that many places that require a great deal of public interaction are now having to give remedial social skills courses to their new employees because they don't know how to carry on a conversation. And we know neurologically that everyone's attention span is getting shorter. Everyone looks more and more like somebody with attention deficit disorder if we put them into an MRI machine. And so this is happening to everyone because everyone has to interact with these screens to some extent.
Mm.
But the more we don't balance that out with long form reading, with long conversations, with times walking through the woods or through the meadow,
Watching the clouds with
watching
some.
the clouds, or just perhaps walking with some degree of intention, but walking without a purpose in our minds that we should be thinking about. And whether it's an old Beatles tune or whether it's suddenly you think of somebody that you knew in school 50 years ago or any of
Mm.
these kind of things. And we
Mm.
wonder, where did that come from?
Mm.
Well, in some sense, there's an openness that a capacity for reverie then cultivates further.
Mm.
And the whole idea of reverie is somewhat, uh, as you pointed out in that passage you read, somewhat looked down on. But everybody had some capacity for reverie, or we could say an enchanted view of the world that saw things as connected in undescribed ways, what Jung calls synchronicities, acausal connections between events or images, things like that. And then the rise of the Enlightenment, which provided some very important
breakthroughs, we can call
developmental
them.
right developmental capacities, and the rise of the observer position, where we can not be directly connected to it and insulate ourselves so that we can study it from outside of it. All of that obviously led to the rise of modern science and things like that. That's been beneficial.
iPads
But
and mobile phones came from
yes, right.
that, maybe.
But they pay off. The downside to that has been a loss of capacity to fall into enchantment with the world. In this chapter that I wrote on watching the clouds, one of the examples I give in the very opening of that chapter is I'm on a run in the morning, and I see this one leaf off in the distance detach from the branch and slowly helicopter down. And watching that leaf slowly descend somehow became timeless. It felt timeless in the moment, as though I couldn't tell how much time was passing. And then the leaf hits the ground and somehow becomes an ordinary leaf again, not an enchanted leaf.
Yeah.
And I enjoy it, but go on with my run. And there's no particular hope. It can't really be, if it's directed, it's not reverie. But many things come.
Can we go back?
Pardon me?
Can we go back
Yeah.
to that? If it's directed, it's not reverie.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we go into a relaxed state of mind, but we have an agenda with it, such as I'm going to relax, or in some, I would say, active imagination in the Jungian world is a reverie-like experience, but because there's an agenda, that the active imaginer sets up before they enter into it. They want to engage with a particular figure, or they want to continue a dream that didn't have an ending onward. Those, as open as they are still an agenda.
Yeah.
And so you're somewhat closing out the possibility of being moved by an unexpected and undetermined thought or direction that we go.
Yeah, got it. To put that in my words, sometimes I go for a walk down to the beach in the mornings. Often I go for a walk down to the beach, and I find the water immediately brings some kind of a reverie, but it's something about letting go of everything on the walk. You have the rhythm of the walk, you let go. You might call it emptiness in Zen Buddhist language or something. It's kind of, you're emptying, and then there's the water in the background, and then it's like the best thoughts come. And you know they're better thoughts because they're not something that you could kind of manufacture with your directed thinking. It's kind of like they've come from that kind of pure space or something. Or
right. Yeah, and in fact, in research with, for example, scientists or mathematicians who work at a high theoretical level, often their tendency will be to just continue working hard, thinking that the hard agenda work exerted towards the problem or the study that they're conducting will result in an insight into the issue. Whereas what we know from neuroscience is you actually need to shut that down periodically. And the brain has a natural organization to do that, what they call the default mode network, which is, when you read a description of default mode network, it's a state of the brain that actually is very consistent with what we call reverie from an analytic standpoint. And that if we don't have enough default mode network time in our schedule, the tendency is for the other primary network is the task specific network, which is what we do when we're planning our grocery list or figuring out how we're going to pay our bills at the end of the month, things like that.
Yeah.
That our effectiveness in the task specific mode goes down. So we're actually, by working harder, we're actually getting in our own way. We're sabotaging it because often the solutions to these very complex problems are not going to come through direct linear rational thought. They're going to come through some sort of image, some sort of sudden insight, a satori insight, and then they can turn that back into theory or into formula. But the solution has to come through a kind of intuitive imagistic perspective first.
Sometimes I get the idea of Carl Jung as he's very permeable, and I mean, I think he might have said that about himself. His walls were kind of permeable or something, but you can see that happening with him. The kind of going into that, what is it, reverie or whatever, and then bringing that back into psychological theory, conceptual language sometimes. And
right, I think he definitely did that. The speculation is that his mother was probably a borderline personality, or perhaps bipolar personality. And so she had very large swings in mood, interaction, and presentation that frightened Carl. And as a boy, but there was a permeability about her psyche that also probably Carl internalizes as his own sort of permeability. And he's just fortunate that he's able to turn his permeability into kind of a way of engaging with the world rather than a burden to carry around.
Yeah, right. Maybe like a lot of novelists and artists and many. I know he didn't like to necessarily look at himself as an artist, but maybe that's a similar kind of thing in a way. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think art is certainly built heavily on reverie, and that many artists are trying to discover, in a sense, through the reverie of their medium that they're working in, whether it's sculpture and clay, whether it's paint, whether it's something else, trying to give some sort of form to their reverie.
So bringing it back to the therapeutic hour, if we could call it that, look. So, okay, firstly, maybe what I've got so far is that, okay, here's this thing that's important that hasn't always been highly valued by our culture, we can say. We live in a fast-paced world, if you want to put it that way. But why are you bringing this up for the therapeutic hour? I know we started with that, but then what is it? Is it a remedial therapy? Is it a way of embracing this part of ourselves, or?
Well, without a capacity for reverie, it's very difficult to have a symbolic process. I would say the two things go hand in hand. And so our symbolic process is also, I would consider, metaphoric process, which is the ability to see the relationship between two things that on surface may not look similar at all, but somehow there's a connection. Like I refer in a couple of different places to a poem by Antonio Machado. And the last line of the poem is sitting, listening on the rim of a vast silence. And so to me, that's this very compelling image of how do you listen to silence and how does silence have a rim? In fact, I may have even mentioned this in our first interview. And so that's kind of, I think, the hallmark of something that has a nature of reverie to it, or the the line from Bob Dylan that you were pointing out. One that comes to my mind is from Maggie's Farm, where he writes about the geometry of innocence the geometry of innocence laid gently on her bones, or something to that effect. And somehow to mash up geometry, innocence, and physical structure, on some level, it doesn't make sense at all. And yet, when you hear it as a package, an image from Dylan, of course it makes sense. And you're going, but you don't know why it makes sense. But so it's this compelling
he was
this
the
capacity
master.
to cross domains.
He was the master of the art of the mercurial juxtaposition of many things, and the answers are blowing in the wind. But why do we need that symbolic function, or to be able to put things together that maybe are not normally put together? I mean, why does a human being need that?
Well, we need it to understand, for one thing. So Jung uses the term reflective function. Other people like Peter Fonagy refer to mentalization. But both of them are referring to the idea of being able to think about what one's experience is. So to be able to think, oh, I'm angry. And instead of just acting on the anger, we're able to think, what am I angry about? And who am I angry with? Without the assumption that it's the person at the counter across from you, your most immediate person. And so that's what reflective function and mentalization are about, is to be able to reflect on one's own experience while it's happening. So let's say somebody comes in and they've had a traumatic childhood, and they've grown up being kind of bullied both within their family and in their school. And they have adopted a kind of victim experience. They've internalized themselves as a victim.
Yeah.
Well, ideally in therapy, we would want to help them understand how that victimhood got imprinted through their experiences, but how it became part of their identity, so that they can gradually begin to relinquish the victim identity and find one that's more consistent with the whole of who they are. And so having this capacity for symbolization, that includes our feelings, that includes our thoughts, that includes the images that pop up in our dreams, but also in our reveries. And so the hallmark of reflective function is this term that's throughout Jung's writings. He says hundreds, if not thousands of times, as if. It's as if this was like that. And so if somebody dreams about a car, and you ask them, well, what kind of car was it? And they said, oh, it was a red Mustang. In fact, it was a 67 red Mustang. And then if we ask them, well, what are your associations to red Mustangs? And they might, oh, I've always wanted one of those, or I had one of those when I was in college, or my dad had one of those, or my friend had one and I always wanted one. Or they say, oh, those are terrible cars. I don't know why they're so popular in the first place. But they're responding only to the car itself as a car in their dream. Now, that's somebody who doesn't have symbolic capacity. They're operating in what we refer to as concrete thinking. Everything is taken on surface face value, and that it can't be something else beneath it, or it can't represent something else. Whereas somebody who's more symbolic thinks, wow, those Mustangs have a lot of horsepower. I really wish I had more horsepower in my life. Then it's already
freedom or wildness, or that little bit of
adventure.
outlaw capacity.
Yeah, or just the imagined excitement of putting the accelerator to the floor and seeing how fast it can go. It can be tons of different things
Mm.
beyond just being a red car.
Yeah.
And so that's the hallmark of it's this as ifness. It's as if the red Mustang can also be adventure or out rebel or all sorts of different things. So that's the hallmark of what we're trying to cultivate in our patients is a greater capacity for symbolism because that's or symbolic capacity because that's also what allows dream work to take us deeper. It's what allows active imagination to be richer, but it's also what allows us to connect to pieces of art and poems and movies and literature is a symbolic capacity.
And it's the function of art and literature and music in the sense of to take us into that space, if I could put it like that.
Exactly. Right. Yeah,
Mm.
if it takes us I mean that's the hallmark is if it takes us into a space.
Mm.
I was just in Paris last week and went to the Rodin Museum and was very much taken in, not just by his, famous works of the Kiss and the Thinker,
Mm.
but also just the animation in the busts of human faces that he created.
Mm.
They don't look realistic in the sense of like a very detailed pen and ink drawing of somebody, but there's so much character in the face that moves you. Or walking into the two rooms that host Monet's water lilies at the L'Orange Museum. Or I went to the 2 weeks before that, I went to a major exhibit of Anselm Kiefer in St. Louis. And that was, I mean, it literally made my heart pound standing in front of some of these things. So I think that good art is going to move people, but when we can connect to it on a symbolic level, it moves us more deeply. So when we see an Anselm Kiefer, which is very dark, he conveys a lot of dark experiences. And somebody who's more concrete might just say, oh, that's really dark. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. Somebody else might say, wow, Anselm Kiefer's ability to convey a depressed experience is so powerful.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Sometimes I think, the default position is, apart from the materialism of modern Western culture, which sometimes just keeps us at the surface, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
there's this default position of moralism that is I think Thomas More once called it like almost a defense mechanism that
Mm-hmm.
by keeping this moral position that, oh, there, we don't like dark things or something like that, but then to actually see some art expresses it so beautifully and deeply
Mm-hmm.
can somehow be transformative. It's more along those lines.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, before we go further, I'd like to read this passage from Raphael Enthoven, who's a French philosopher
Yeah.
who also operates in the public sphere as well. But I found this in the New York Times, and I was so moved by it. He says, daughter of consciousness and sleep, reverie blends their realms. Like intoxication, reverie is lucidity without an object, an activity, but one that's passive, a search that begins by giving up and lets itself be dazzled rather than looking. It remains happily somewhere between imagination and the ability to put it to use. Reverie is contemplation from within, letting the person who gives way to it feel change. Born of the desire and not the need to be directly involved in our surroundings, reverie strips the world of its utility. It borrows the power of narration from wakefulness and the power of divination from sleep, and keeps them vying to suspend the alternation of day and night. Reverie is how one arrives at immediacy. Reverie never rests because it generously accords the world the absent-mindedness it deserves. Reverie is light years distant from being a distraction, which does reality the considerable honor of turning its back on it. In fact, reverie celebrates the rediscovery of understanding and imagination, sets free the secret of disinterest, which, because it lets you see beauty without your consent and see nature without ego, invests the world with intense interest. I don't know exactly when 2011, and I still get goosebumps reading that out loud.
Mm. It seems to link, I get a few hints from that. Like it reminded me of the goddess of memory. I never know how to say her name, Mnemosyne or uh,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah, I'm not sure I know the pronunciation either, but I know who you're referring to.
I always read these things and then it becomes dangerous when you actually verbalize them. But it what I get from that too is it links, okay, there's reverie as we've been talking about, non-directed and the openness, but it's linking into bigger things as well, like distant memories that are so essential or there or
Hmm.
um, deep, deep primordial or archaic memories or something along those lines.
Hmm. Yeah, I think probably deja vu experiences fall into that category. That who knows what experience we're picking up on.
And reverie towards the cosmos. Again, drawing on Thomas More for a second, I think he said something along the lines of a certain amount of enchantment is essential every day. That
Hmm.
just for that fact alone, this thing of uh, enchantment, uh,
Hmm.
it somehow, well, what does it do? It kind of nourishes the soul or something.
Yeah, I find that every single day, just about, unless it's particularly overcast or raining, but I'll take my dog out for an early morning walk, usually near sunrise. And so often I get during the course of the walk, I get to see the sun rising and, the light illuminating the clouds or uh, the pink sphere appearing off in the horizon. And so to me, this is a very enchanting both vision, but also just an enchanting time of the day. Uh,
Mm.
it seems to me. And I love the feeling of being up when many other people are not up, as though there's a kind of a silence in the world for me.
Yeah, which is the Indian idea of the Brahm Murat. They called the morning, early morning, the time of the very beginning. There's kind
Uh-huh.
of some, I don't know, something kind of wonderful about that.
Hmm.
The earth is waking up.
Hmm. Yeah, somehow I'm in my reverie, I'm thinking, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking of Jung's experience of going to Africa. And he said, until I saw the sun coming up over the African plain, uh, I never really understood fully why uh, the sun was a deity for so many.
Yeah,
And he
right.
said, now I feel it.
I think maybe many people have had that experience in India too, like I have. It's something that the land is so ancient, and the
Mm-hmm.
sun, a sunrise in India, from my experience, is like it's different from a sunrise here. It's
Mm-hmm.
something you've got this vast archaic land, and then you've got this deity emerging from the sky,
Mm-hmm.
into the
Yeah.
cosmos or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, I just I like the stuff how you're drawing some of the right brain. I mean, I know you've already done it as we've been talking, but I wonder whether you could maybe relate um, some more from that, from the brain research material.
Well, they've done one of the things that I think about as interesting is first the neuroscience of metaphor. And we may have touched on this a little bit too in our first talk, but just the idea that you can put somebody into an fMRI machine and have them read ordinary prose, as we might see in a newspaper article, and something from Shakespeare or James Joyce or Yeats or some other poet, but somebody who's writing with frequent use of metaphor. And we can see from those neuroscience studies that the brain reacts very differently to metaphor than it does to ordinary prose. And it becomes both more enlivened, more associative networks lighting up, but it also moves out of, when we're reading ordinary prose, most of our the center of mass of activity is in our frontal cortex, where we do all of our conscious executive planning, like we talked about before, the groceries. So how am I going to drive? Which roads am I going to go on to drive home? Things like that. How am I going to get this report done in time? And it's usually unicameral, so it tends to focus in the left hemisphere. And where our logical, or our more I wouldn't say logical, actually, that's kind of a misinterpretation of left brain, right brain. It's that our more word-based, language-based activation is going on. When we experience metaphor, it becomes bicameral. In other words, both hemispheres of the brain are activated, and it drops down from the frontal cortex into the midbrain, which is where we do our most fundamental emotional processing. So metaphor activates the brain more fully and moves us into contact with our emotional centers. So that's one of the things that I would say about it. The other is that they did some interesting research on identifying young science and math prodigies, not just just generally skilled in high school. And what they found was that that these kids who are actually pretty gifted at science or math, they're not all in the left brain as many people would think. They're actually
It can be a
in
little
this,
typecast.
right. It becomes absolutely typecast. And so what we find is that the ones who are the most gifted in these areas are actually the ones who are most dominated by bicameral activation.
Right. That's good.
And so there's this saying by Kant, I'm going to paraphrase it slightly, but the meaning's largely the same. Thoughts without feelings are blind. Feelings without thoughts are dead. And so it highlights this fundamental interaction between thought and feeling, or image and language, that they really are richer together rather than separate. So I hope that's the thing that everybody that listens takes away, is that no, we don't want to be right-brained. We want to be more facile at allowing things to move back and forth between the hemispheres, and having dreamy periods of the day when you're not really focused on something, even if it's just 10 minutes sitting with your eyes closed and waiting to see what comes up, if anything, will actually facilitate the development of that capacity to activate both hemispheres. And it's just Alan Shore's research on hemispheric activation, that we're flipping back and forth. We can easily flip back and forth in milliseconds. But what we want to do is recognize when we've, in a sense, shut down to one hemisphere or the other.
Yeah. But I sometimes think of the revenge of the right brainers because if it's if it's like meaning I know this stuff is more complicated than portrayed in just this
Right.
left brain, right brain thing. But I sometimes think of what's been inferiorized, like in terms of dominance and inferiorization, that
Hmm.
perhaps the right brainers are finding some kind of a language for bringing some of their preferences back a little, but ultimately, of course, I mean, I remember reading somewhere that Albert Einstein, I don't know whether we talked about this, but I was definitely chatting about it with someone. Um, he wasn't necessarily the top of the physics class, or he wasn't the, um, uh, it was his ability, it seems to me, that, to move between dream,
Hmm.
image, and science, and that
Hmm.
bicameral nature of it, that seemed to be the thing that he really had so strongly,
Hmm.
which is just to back up what you were saying.
Right. I think he definitely had quite a bit of the absent-minded professor about him. And when we talk about the absent-minded professor, we're talking about somebody who's probably in a kind of dreamy state and has forgotten their notebook or their whatever their identification badge or something. They're quite gifted, but because they're off into some other universe in their mind, they're not quite as attentive to ordinary day-to-day details.
Mm.
In fact, when I know that when Einstein was first went into primary school, they thought he was intellectually deficit because he spoke so little. They thought he was mute. Uh,
Mm. Yeah. Which again brings up this thing of diagnosis, how scary diagnosis can be, because, these days you'd probably be given, Ritalin or something.
Something like that, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, there was another area I wanted to talk to you about, Marcus, because I know you're into music a lot, and um, you wrote your book on the blues. So how does this relate, this
Hmm.
topic of reverie, to music and the blues? Because and if I can just jump ahead a little, is that I see the therapeutic hour, or people going to therapy, as a possible way of what you call the symbolizing process, or
Hmm.
whatever, a way of awakening more of that as if ability.
Hmm.
But it also has ramifications for creativity. It seems to me that being open to this style or space or whatever is very important for fulfilling creative instincts, or to satisfy them.
Hmm.
And you see it in the musicians, don't you? They seem to be open to
Hmm.
that kind of.
I think we see it at its highest form in jazz, because when jazz musicians are on stage together, and there's four or five people on stage,
Mm,
and they play together, usually straight through if it's an agreed upon melody, like they're playing, uh, some kind of jazz standard. Then the idea is for one of the members to step up and take a solo.
mm,
And that's his reinterpretation improvisationally on the fly in the moment of what he heard inside the melody. And then the next player is going to jump in and do both what the first player did. He's going to reinterpret the melody, but he's also going to be making little interactions or comments musically on the first player. And so it's kind of like the old telephone game where when we were in primary school and you had to whisper in somebody's ear, and then the next person whispered the same thing, and in the next year, and by the time you got around the circle, it completely changed meaning.
yeah.
And that's what a jazz band is going to do is essentially they're playing this game of telegram, and then everybody comes back to the agreed upon melody at the end of the song, and they play it what they call play it straight again. And without improvisation. So for me, improvisation of allowing musical ideas to flow in the moment without pre-composition, that's a musical reverie that's occurring. And there's kind of a group dynamic where everybody is kind of, number one, locked into the beat. And so that's kind of the organic glue that's holding everybody together. And then in some ways I think there is this unconscious, unspoken linking and unintentional but inevitable linking that's going on between the members of the group, as long as the group is kind of gelled and has an experience of each other. And so that's where I see it as its highest, or I think also actually in things like hip hop and rap, but not just the rap, because many rappers are actually reciting lyrics they've composed ahead of time. But there used to be these, and probably still are, these rap competitions where they step into the center of the circle and they start rapping, and then somebody else jumps out to challenge them with a rap, and they're feeding off of each other. And naturally, that has to be improvisational as well. And you have to have an ability to just let the words flow without thinking about the words ahead of time, because it's all coming too fast for you to actually, oh, what's a good comeback to this? The good ones are the ones that in these wrap-offs that have the ability to just let it flow and assume that there's going to be a form and a focus to it when it comes out without thinking about what that is.
Well, I think that speaks to anyone that's doing creative work, because for a writer, for example, we
Mm-hmm.
know about the inner critic or the inner judge or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
that the bravery, as Rollo May said, the courage to create or whatever, that to
Yeah.
improvise, to get something on the page, to come up with
Mm-hmm.
a first draft, or to
Mm-hmm.
to to put aside the critical part and then come, as you say, the bicameral bit is maybe to come back later with the with,
Right.
with that more critical part.
Yeah, I think, and even in the painting of a still life, for example, where you've got your bowl of fruit sitting in front of you and you're painting that bowl of fruit, but then there's still, in a sense, a kind of improvisational interaction with that actual bowl of fruit in terms of the color and the texture and the tones of what's appearing on the canvas. And so it's going to look somewhat like the bowl of fruit there, but it's also going to have the individual imprint of the artist that's shaped by their personality, their preferences, the art that they've seen previously.
Mm.
And, and there's she's deceased now, but a contemporary abstract artist named Joan Mitchell, and she does, and there's others that do this, but she does what's called gestural art.
Right.
And she tries to have a paintbrush in her hand, and she'll stand in front of the canvas until she has some sort of urge to make a gesture on the canvas.
Right. Right.
But
It's
it's
kind of
very much
performative
trying
art
to,
as well.
in a way, it can be performative art. Particularly if you do it in front of an audience that's part of an event, watching you create in the moment.
Yes.
But for her, it's like not trying to understand what she's trying to create. She's not trying to create anything. She's assuming that if she stands in front of the canvas with paint on a brush, she's going to feel an urge to make some sort of movement or gesture on that. And she just trusts that that's what needs to come out. And she doesn't really think about it as what is it?
Mm.
In fact, it's not supposed to be anything in particular most times, although sometimes you can infer loose figures and things in her artwork. but it's primarily about her use of space, her use of color, and the sense that there's a feeling that's different when you look at one of her art pieces, in that what's missing is this intentional structurizing of the image.
Mm.
And so there's this loose, deconstructed feeling to it that evokes a completely different feeling than standing in front of a Rembrandt, which is amazing also,
Yeah, yeah.
but amazing in a different way.
Mm. Yeah, that's good. So what does that mean for the therapist that takes all this on board? He becomes a bit more of a, what's the word, improviser within the therapeutic session,
If we
or
can learn to
gestural.
it gestural or improvisational. I mean, it's not that I don't filter what comes up. I certainly think I have an experience of what's coming up, whether it's a feeling or an image or memory. And I'm not immediately speaking aloud to the patient. Oh,
Mm,
that makes me think of this. What
mm,
I'm doing is I have an intermediate stage where I'm aware of what came up and I'm thinking about it in relationship to what does this have to do with this person that's sitting with me or lying beside me on the couch. Uh, and so that's the therapeutic use of it, is to assume that in some way what I'm having a reverie around is also connected to the patient. So it's
right.
important not to dismiss things prematurely and assume that they're just white noise in the background. And this
Oh,
actually fits very, very well with Jung's diagram that some of the listeners may be familiar with. It's in Psychology of the Transference,
right.
where it's basically a rectangle,
Mm,
and there's four corners to the rectangle with lines connecting all of the four corners, but also lines cutting across the rectangle, connecting the corners opposite each other together. And so his idea is that he uses it to represent the idea that we have a conscious to conscious interaction.
yeah.
We're also interacting with our own unconscious, and each of our unconscious processes are interacting with each other. And so it's at that unconscious level of communication that reverie and what comes up in reverie becomes meaningful, because it's like we're both dipping our feet in the same pool of water,
Yeah.
even though we can't see each other's feet.
And what I would get from that is it's not we're not separated sometimes. Like someone, again, this may have come up when we first talked, but someone could say something, pulling from the ether almost, it
Mm-hmm.
would seem, but say something
Mm-hmm.
which is so relevant in that kind of
Mm-hmm.
state that those words become very, very significant and very important and say synchronistic in Carl Jung language.
Right, right. It would be, you could classify it as a synchronicity, that something that's in some way alive in the patient then becomes also alive in the therapist. And that the therapist is the one that brings it into the verbal realm, makes a comment from it or about it. And so that I'm mentioning that just because there is a kind of a discussion that goes on within the analytic world about whether we tell the patient directly what's in our reverie. Oh, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of this movie, The Matrix. That's speaking about one's reverie. Or I can have a reverie about The Matrix, and I can begin to wonder how The Matrix relates to this person. And maybe I think of the idea of taking the red, blue, or the blue pill. And one allows us to be comfortable but not engaged with reality, and the other pill allows us to be engaged with reality but not necessarily comfortable because we see all of the flaws in reality. And so I might be thinking, oh, I wonder which of the pills this patient has taken, even though I know she hasn't taken a pill, but it's the idea of which version of life is she engaged with. And so I might either make a reference some without alluding to the movie directly, uh, or it's in the culture enough that I might say, oh, it sounds like you decided to take the red pill today.
Mm.
Maybe the patient's seen this movie. Maybe
Mm.
she knows what the red pill is.
Mm.
But instead of saying, oh, I'm thinking about the Matrix and they take these pills in it, and do you think you've taken a pill? I'm just turning it into a metaphor for
Mm.
her relationship to her world.
Mm.
Or I might say, I wonder if it's more, I might just use the blue pill, red pill metaphor without referring to the pills at all. I might just say, it feels like you've locked into a version of reality that's more comfortable, but not quite accurate.
Mm.
And then I'm still in the matrix, but the patient has no idea that I'm in the matrix. And it really depends on there I'm speaking from the reverie rather than about the reverie.
But what can the therapist learn from the patient in that? Because in Alan Shaw's unconscious to unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
isn't there a certain democratization of the
Well, what I mean, there are always, in terms of learning from the patient, there are always things going on that we learn if we're tuned into, we learn about the patient if we're tuned into this idea that there's this whole realm of experience that we haven't thought about yet, what generally gets referred to as the otherness of the other. Uh,
mm,
so I might have an impression of you, and I might think, oh, he's from Australia, and he's this kind of guy, and he's that kind of guy, and I might feel pretty confident. But if I go into an analytic section like that, I'm foreclosing on everything that I don't know because I'm already assuming that you fit into known categories that I've previously experienced. And then we're not going to discover anything new.
so you might just mark me down as an ex-surfy or something like that, and then
And then I'll start funneling everything you say through, oh, the ex surfy channel.
yeah. Mm.
So I think, but also what I think it does is it, oh, it reaffirms my faith in all of these processes. Each time I have a reverie that I find a way to incorporate into the analytic session,
Mm.
and it feels like it opens something up, leads to greater connection with the patient, leads to the patient understanding
Yeah,
themselves better,
yeah, yeah,
all of these things. It reaffirms of like, oh, there is this thing here
yeah,
that's not controllable,
yeah.
but we can practice in a way that allows us to open to it more readily.
Uh, to use a bit of the jargon, that if we touch upon the collective unconscious, there'll be a certain depth there, probably, which is
Mm-hmm.
somehow humanly connecting. You know,
Right.
it's that which makes us deeply human. You know, and
Mm-hmm.
that brings a different feeling, which brings us back to this complicated question of everyone scrolling through on the phone and. Um, which I would maybe liken to kind of like the McDonald's of kind of imagery or something. It's kind of like it's half satisfying or minimally
Mm-hmm.
satisfying with when we're
Mm-hmm.
really looking for that kind of deep, those deeper images from the collective unconscious or something along
Yeah,
those lines.
I think that's, you know, to take this one step further into AI,
Yeah,
and AI, there are remarkable things that AI does.
yeah,
And if you tell it, oh, give me a, as one of my patients did,
mm,
um, he said, give me an image of a man walking down a trail. And so it gives him an image. And then he decides, oh, it doesn't quite fit what I'm feeling. He says, I want it to be darker and more melancholy. And so it starts to change the facial image of the guy walking down the trail, and then he wants it to have a little bit scarier quality, and some skulls show up on the trail. And so it's a pretty satisfying image for him that it connects him to something that's it corresponds, resonates with his inner experience. But my, and I think that's a useful, but is there a way in which now he's, in a sense, being mirrored by AI? But if there was another way of getting at that experience that felt like it emerged from inside of him, whether it's a dream or something he drew, for example, would it have been an image, an experience that went even deeper because it emerged from inside of him?
Do you think that's true? I
I
mean,
think it is.
I was thinking while you were talking, Hillman talks about the making, the soul making,
Mm-hmm.
that I've spoken to a couple of people who are, let's say, optimists in terms of
Mm-hmm.
AI or whatever. And they might say that they really are involved in the making there. So
Mm-hmm.
what's the difference between me having a dream and working with that image and
Mm-hmm.
them working with an image with AI? They might say, well, what's different about that?
Well, for me, I can give you one example of this that happened for me.
Yeah.
Um, is that when I was doing the shared realities book, and I happened to bump into another Jungian analyst who I had never met before, who did the artwork for a friend's books.
Right.
And I was looking at the book table at this conference, and I said, I really love the. I just kind of said out loud, I really love the covers, and she happened to be standing right next to me, and
Mm.
said, "Oh, actually, I painted that." And I
Right.
said, "Oh my gosh, you're kidding! I love these. I love the style."
Mm.
And her name was Susan Bostrom Wong, and she's a Jungian analyst in San Francisco who's also an artist. And she said,
Mm.
"Well, if you'd like, I can paint something for your next book cover."
Mm.
And I was working on shared realities, and I said, "That'd be great." And she said, "Go look at my webpage. You have my permission to use any image that's on the webpage."
Right.
And I found one section that had the style I wanted, but not the image I wanted. And I said,
Mm.
"I want this style." And she said, "Write me a paragraph describing what you're looking for." And so I sent her this 3 or 4 sentences
Yeah.
about what I was looking for. And she sends me back this painting that's just astonishingly like what's in my mind.
Right.
And she said, "Is there anything missing?" And I said, "Yeah, I need some sense of energy kind of between them." And she sends back another photograph, and now it's got these kind of uh, yellowish lines ascending and descending through this blue field. And that literally was, now to me, that's the magic, is that she can take these words that are not very specific and somehow have an image in her mind that was so close to the image in my mind. And I just don't think it would have felt like magic that a program can generate something close through an algorithm, because we know that's what it's doing. It's working off of algorithms, and
Mm.
it's forming composite images of previously uh, digested images, and it's not really creating something new in the way we think of creative newness. It's
Mm.
a ongoing recombination of
Of
known
of what's there.
works.
Mm. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not
It's a
that
big area.
I think it can be very moving and powerful, but I think there also is the potential of a loss.
And it seems to me what you were just talking about there is it brings in the other element is the connection that you built with that person, the rapport, the mutual exchange,
Hmm.
the so fulfilling within its own right. And
Hmm. Right.
there'd obviously be so many artists, creators, extremely worried about this production through AI. But then I do remember, um, someone saying that what she's done is she has a custom AI. I don't pretend to
Hmm.
be over it too much, but it's kind of like she has a customized AI where she's put in, this is Bonnie Bright was saying this, that
Ah, hmm.
she's put in her writings, researches, stuff like that into the customized AI. And so what she's getting back, and other writings
Hmm.
that she's liked and things like that. So when she said that, I was thinking, well, perhaps one is getting something a little back from the collective unconscious. It's possible, but with
Yeah, if we
many,
think of collective unconscious as repeated patterns of common human experience, and there's these linguistic studies that study the basic story forms of humankind going back as far as there was written language.
yeah,
And basically, they say there are 7 to 8 basic fundamental themes across all stories, both ancient and contemporary, and that new stories are really novel recombinations of these same basic 7 or 8 themes. And
yes,
so, if we think about that as that there's still individual creativity, but they kind of have a form of sorts that shapes that activity. Uh, just like as human beings, we hear in a certain range of sounds, we see visually in a certain range, we have a certain range of taste buds in our olfactory system, we have certain sensitivities to certain smells in
mm,
our olfactory system, or the other one is the gustatory system, and that those are going to determine a lot of what how we respond to our environment, because there's things going on in the environment that we just don't have the sensory apparatus to perceive, but our dog has sensory apparatus to perceive, and
mm,
so on and so on. And so I think of archetypes as both universal patterns that have accumulated over time, and also that our system is archetypal, that it's going to determine how a large part of how we experience things.
mm,
So, for as Eric Goodwin, I was at the IAAP Congress in Zurich in August, and Goodwin was on one of the panels, and um, he was saying that dark is not dark is not seen as frightening or potentially evil because it is evil. It's because of our limitations of our visual apparatus, and that we are a species that doesn't see well in the dark, as opposed to bats and raccoons that see extremely well in the dark. So
right.
there's nothing frightening
To
about the dark,
bats and
bats and
raccoons.
raccoons. But to us,
Mm,
it evokes a sense of, I can't see what's going on. I feel out of control. And so there's a certain amount of anxieties, fears, uneasiness
mm,
that comes along with being in the dark.
mm,
And that's shaped by our perceptual apparatus.
mm.
In fact, what was it? Stevens wrote this book, the
Anthony
2 million.
Stevens, are we talking
Yeah,
about?
Anthony Steve. Yeah, yeah, and he speaks about the 2 million-year-old man, and in some
Mm,
sense, and Jung also he takes that from Jung. Actually, we're all two
yeah,
million years old,
yeah.
the origins of the human species, and so the idea that we still have all of these vestiges of that in us, like the our tongue is extremely sensitized to foreign objects. And the evolutionary purpose of that is you didn't want to swallow whatever you were eating if it had a bunch of gravel in it.
Right.
So evolutionarily,
Mm.
the tongue is conditioned to identify and spit out foreign objects that aren't going to be palatable or digestible or may even cause harm to us if we ingest them.
Mm.
And so my dentist, I had some straightening some wires put behind my teeth to help straighten them. And he said, these are going to drive you crazy for a month. You just have to wait it out and it'll go away. And I said, why does it do that? And he explained this whole evolutionarily, this is what the tongue is for. And so it's going to rub back and forth against these foreign objects until it comes to accept them as a known thing that's not going to do harm. And then it just stops,
Mm.
as though the tongue has a mind and a processing unit, an intentionality all its own that's separate from our frontal cortex.
Yeah. That it kind of I got when you were saying that as well, like when Marie-Louise von Franz talks about has that graph or the line with archetypes and instincts
Mm-hmm.
that kind of instinctuality that
Mm-hmm.
or instinctual intelligence we could say too.
Right. And Jung even describes the archetype as the image of the instinct,
Right.
kind of implying that you really can't ever sort out what's archetype and what's instinct. It
Instinct.
all runs together.
Mm. Now, I know we're probably going over, although it's very interesting, Mark. I've just got two very quick questions. Firstly, I was just thinking of this as we were speaking. In terms of, and maybe this is a topic for some other occasion in the distant future, but politics and therapy is that um, neutrality. Sometimes I kind of think I'm a little bit old school in that. I think that the therapist should be neutral, political.
Mm-hmm.
But then I know there's many people that don't think that,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the present environs, that those that remain silent are complicit to the goings on. But I mean, can you just say one or two things about that as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a unsettling trend that's occurring both in the Jungian world and in the psychoanalytic world,
Yeah,
that it's shifting towards a great deal more focus of social activism,
yeah,
and that we should be, with the philosophy that we should be social activists in our consulting rooms.
mm,
And I disagree with that idea. I think that um, as soon as we introduce social agendas into the analytic room, it's no longer analysis, because analysis is ideally to engage with the unconscious, which is something we don't know and we only get glimpses of through dreams, slips of the tongue, fantasies, things like that,
mm,
or behaviors that
mm,
the origin of the source of the behavior is unconscious.
mm,
And as soon as we start saying, well, analysis should be making people more aware of racial issues or more sensitive to racial issues, now you've got a whole different component. Uh, and those positions are fine, and I support the values behind those positions. I think we should be aware, but I don't think the analytic space, the therapeutic space, is the place to try to impose those agendas, which are subjectively my agendas, even if I think I have good reason for holding them.
yeah,
And so it's the only time I bring it to someone's attention is when I feel they are holding a view that creates limitations or disruptions in their own life,
right,
and how holding that. So, like, maybe they have extreme political views and they don't see why everybody, the way they present them to everybody in their families or friends, is getting alienated by them.
Mm,
And then I might call, this political view that you feel the need to speak about so often.
mm,
It doesn't seem like you're quite aware of how that's impacting your relationships.
mm.
And then we're already away from what the view is to focus on the impact on the relationships.
Yeah.
And so that's the only time I bring it up,
Mm,
unless somebody is in a particularly extreme position and they're interacting with me in a way that they want me to endorse or support or agree with their position.
right.
And so that usually has, in the United States anyway, has come from more conservative viewpoints.
Right.
And I will say something like, this comes up quite a lot. It feels as if you would like me to agree with you, and yet I think you also have some intuition that I probably don't have the same positions you do.
Mm,
So it makes me wonder why you keep bringing it up with me.
mm.
So then we're in again away from the view itself and more into why are they introducing this
Yeah.
over and over again.
That
So
reminds
that's
me of a
my view about
deliteralization in Hillman language. It's kind of like, you know, taking out of the literal concrete view
right.
that someone's carrying
Hmm.
around or whatever.
Right. Right. So that's my view, and I understand why people have different views. I just don't. More and more of our conferences have been taken over, in my view, by these social agendas, speaking about these social agendas. And we should
Mm,
be aware of them because they are impacting all of our patients and clients.
yeah.
But again, I don't think it's the analyst or therapist's job to give the patient what they perceive as their correct views.
It's kind of
And so there's more and more of our conferences. Oh, go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
you finished. You finished.
More and more of our conferences get taken up with this material. And I don't think by any means we've perfected the process of analysis that we can set that to the side and not have continuing ongoing discussions about our theories of analysis and our methods of analysis. And I'm most interested in being a good practitioner of the art of analysis itself
Yeah,
rather than promoting a social agenda.
a social agenda. Yeah, that's good. And I sometimes find it's nice to dip back into, the Heinrich Zimmers and the Eric Nymans
Mm-hmm.
and uh, the pre-political,
Mm-hmm.
although they did live in political times, those people,
Sure.
but it kind of gives that depth of, what you're looking for within the therapeutic or the Jungian world or whatever, rather
Mm-hmm.
than just that kind of modern social context. But then, it's something that people have a variety of views on. And one other question, the last question I've got for you is
Okay.
participation mystique. How is it connected to Reverie? And maybe when I first started reading Jung, there's this idea that perhaps that happened in traditional tribal cultures,
Mm-hmm.
in so-called primitive cultures, and that maybe it was a little bit uh, uh, we shouldn't get caught up just in
Mm-hmm.
participation mystique or whatever, but maybe we
Well,
should a
that's
little.
that's kind of been how participation mystique has been characterized by Jung and by many Jungians after him as kind of with a negative connotation of that there's something of loss of ego involved, ego centeredness, ego awareness, and there's kind of a blurring of boundaries. And that was seen as kind of a negative thing. And then Neumann, in some of his writings, speaks about, or is it Edinger? I'm getting confused now about, I think it's Neumann, about this idea of field knowledge and that it's not something negative. It's that we're in blurring the boundaries between you and I. We're actually having a richer field of experience than if we were just in our own encapsulated space. And so I think there's a great deal of value in being able to enter that space, and also great dangers in entering that space, in the sense of this is where crowdthink comes in.
Yeah.
When the crowd becomes a mob rather than a crowd.
Non-discriminatory thinking can easily take over.
Right, exactly. And so that's a participation mystique as well.
Yeah.
And so for me, the positive sides of it is, like, there was an experience. I used to have a bluegrass band, and we had a regular guitar player, and for one reason or another, he couldn't make it that night. And he was a good guitar player, but the guy we invited to come sit in with us was a really great guitar player. And it's like, he's not saying anything to us.
Right.
He's not telling us any instruction, but we performed at a whole different level that night.
Yeah.
Because of who he was in the group and the kind of foundational space he created around his guitar playing. And then we all played better. And
That's
so I
true.
think that's a good example of one of the positive things that can come out of participation mystique, or any experience of church, of synagogue, of mosque that's moving. It's moving because of the space we're in, but also because of the intentionality of the people around us. And so there's a participation mystique that goes into deepened spiritual experience through the gathering of a feeling of like felt people.
Yeah. It's a big area. I mean, it can be dicey because that's what happens in cults too, because of the force field, if you want to put it, of the intentionality. There's an experience, but it seems to require some balance between discrimination and
Right.
But it also seems to me that in the last chapter of Gaston Bachelard's book, The Poetics of Reverie, is Reverie and the Cosmos, is the participation mystique with the cosmos. It gets back to that enchantment you were talking. It's that giving over to the cosmos is somehow enriching as well.
Yeah, I was on a backpacking trip in northern New Mexico, and we were about 30 or 40 miles away from the nearest artificial light. And we went to sleep that night, and I got up in the middle of the night, woke up about 2 a.m. and decided to look outside the tent. And it was like nothing I'd ever seen. I mean, it felt like we were in the Milky Way. I mean, we are in the Milky Way, but I mean, it really felt like this complete canopy of stars and gases that I'd never been in a location to really see it like this before. And that was definitely a reverie with the cosmos. In fact, I woke up everybody in the camp that night and said, you have to come and look at this.
That's one that is good to be directive in those situations.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to leave it.
Okay.
The reverie of the cosmos. And thank you very much. I know we've gone for quite some time, but it's good stuff and
Okay,
very
John.
interesting.
All right.
Thank
Talk
you.
to you later. Bye-bye.